All right, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to episode 1, technically, of the Play These Things podcast. This is Alex/Alyosha speaking. I'm here with Andy and Nate, and we're going to give this thing another crack. How are you guys doing?
I'm good.
How do you guys feel about looking back at the last episode?
Sounds good.
Let's reflect. You can't get anywhere without good critical reflection.
I think I was surprised. We actually got some views. One of the best compliments I heard from Andy saying that a friend of his had listened to it in the car. We got our first comment. I don't know from who.
I also should point out that was a select button friend too. So it's like, I know, yeah.
That's
my friend Brendan. I think he goes under Laurel Soup.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know I think the person who commented has a different name, but I just saw a comment on the podcast on the WordPress saying "great and nerdy" or something like that. So I was like, okay,
excellent.
Yeah,
sweet.
So it's a start.
Yeah. So I think this episode we are going to spend a little bit of time doing some of the same of reflecting on what we've been playing recently and kind of just following that thread, seeing where it goes. And then we spent a little bit of time in episode 0, as it was, talking about the Scratchware manifesto and play this thing, which was part of the inspiration for this podcast. And since we didn't really have time to treat that properly in the last episode, we thought we'd spend the second half of the podcast talking more in depth about the Scratchware manifesto and reflecting on some of the themes and what is still relevant, what isn't relevant. So, and I think that'll kind of form the two halves there. So, yeah. So maybe we can start with what we have all been playing recently. What have you been playing, Andy?
So I've been playing. It's weird. I bought Yakuza a couple weeks ago and I liked it, but then all of a sudden, about 5 hours into it, something just clicked, and like I marathoned through. I think I played probably like 20 hours in like 4 days, which for me is like a lot.
Oh,
yeah. So I played through the whole main
nothing.
Yeah, and I was telling Nate, it's really funny. The post game is just basically like a open worldy. You kind of do the mini games. You can get into brawls. You can earn money. There's like little like side quests, stuff like that. Of all people, my girlfriend, who like didn't really pay attention to the plot, she like loves the post game. She just keeps like playing it and like getting into brawls and doing all the mini games and stuff. It's really fun because there's a lot of like side stories, that are kind of entertaining, where your character gets scammed and has to get money back, or gets like, most of it's just like him getting conned or trying to help people, and it like backfires. It's pretty funny. The other thing I've been playing that I really should beat because I love it is the Lion Song, which just came out on the Switch.
Oh, I saw that.
And it's so good. Like, it's so good.
That looks really, really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. The art is gorgeous. I love the writing, and it's really just about human connection and sort of how the smallest decisions can like completely change someone's life. And it's interesting because when you're playing it, it doesn't really feel like you have a lot of choice. But then when you beat each episode, it comes up with the screen saying, 80% of people playing this game did this, or 40% did this. And they seem like really minor details, but they end up, as you start playing through all the episodes, they become very significant details. If you choose not to buy a painting from this artist in one episode, and the next one, he's like more down on his luck, or it's kind of a neat like interplay, like characters kind of glint in and out of all 4 stories. I heard the 4th one really brings it together. I haven't played that episode yet.
Okay, it sounds a lot like the Telltale games that they do. Every time you make a decision, it'll say, so and so will remember that, and then at the end of the episode, it'll say 80% of players did this, 20% of players did this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's funny to be in the minority in those moments because it's a single player game, but you suddenly find yourself scrutinizing your own decisions based on like peer pressure almost, like you're an outcast for having been the 10% who decided to not help someone or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to preserve immersion while also sort of showing you that that your choices do have consequence. Here, I'm thinking, I haven't played this, but someone was telling me just recently about what's the name of it? The new game from the developer who made Heavy Rain, something Detroit.
Oh,
Detroit
Become
Become Human.
Human.
Yes, Detroit Become Human. Apparently, that game sort of breaks immersion a little bit by showing you, or giving you the option at least, to look at the like massive branching tree of possibilities, so that you can see like the immense quality of writing
So
they put
I've
into
been
it.
playing.
It actually feels
Right,
good.
walk you through the.
I like the like social pressure angle a lot. That's kind of neat.
Yeah. Is it? You said it
Developer
has
who made
something to
Heavy
do with
Rain, something
Vienna
Detroit.
or something? Is it?
Oh,
What's the
Detroit
kind of
Become
setting?
Human. Yeah, so
Yes.
it's a really I teach European history, so I find the setting really interesting. It takes place in Vienna in the early 1900s, so basically about maybe a decade before World War One. And Vienna was a cultural center, so it was a center of mathematics and art, literature, science, psychology. One of your characters actually goes to a therapy session with Sigmund Freud, which is kind of
Oh,
hilarious.
that's cool.
Yeah, so it's just like it's just an interesting setting because obviously within 10 to 15 years it's destroyed. That's all gone essentially. And then you have the war, and then the rise of fascism, and you know.
That's interesting. And you said it's kind of an adventure game structure, or
Kind of, yeah. It's point and click, so very dialogue based. A lot of the game is your character having, or characters really having creative problems and trying to find, inspiration, or having writer's block. So you kind of interact with the environment around you to manipulate it to make them feel inspired, you know. Um, so yeah, the mathematician has to go to the library and navigate all these ideas, and she sees shapes in her everyday life, that kind of thing.
that's cool. I've kind of fallen. I bought it, and I'm putting off Breath of the Wild. But I'm even doing. I have kind of fallen into what Nate said about putting off Breath of the Wild even further with like the amount of indie games I've been consuming. I actually was really keen on getting Octopath Traveler, and I couldn't get it in time because there weren't stocks. So I ended up picking up Hollow Knight. So I bought the Lion Song, wanted Octopath Traveler, and didn't play either one of them. Ended up playing Hollow Knight in the end. But I'm really, really enjoying Hollow Knight, and I don't know if either of you played it, but it's another one of these riffs on the Metroidvania formula. But besides just amazing art and kind of a really atmospheric, melancholic kind of story and setting, it's been doing a few things that I really enjoy. In terms of the little twist it's putting on the genre and on the platforming formula. Specifically, I was telling Nate that it does something that I haven't seen. I know it exists in some of these games, but it allows you to heal yourself no matter where you are, as long as you have some of this what's called soul energy. So in the game, it's a Metroidvania. You're delving deeper into these subterranean caverns of this bug kingdom, this ancient bug kingdom. And you're this little warrior guy, and every time you hit something, you get a little bit of energy. And you can use that energy for attacks, but you can also just heal yourself. And it's a really minor decision, a really minor choice, but I found myself, it makes the whole way the game feels different than a lot of these other ones, because it's not necessarily a marathon between save points. These enemies it's not a scouring for potions kind of situation. What it really does is it makes it feel as dangerous as it can feel the deeper you go. It kind of makes it feel like the entire game is your oyster, because as long as, there are certain areas that are blocked off to you until you have a certain ability, but there's always somewhere else to explore. And as long as you can keep going and keep healing, it makes it this very fluid, very open-ended experience, and I've been loving it. I really do want to try Octopath and some of this other stuff.
Connection,
like I've said,
sort of how
I've been absolutely loving it, and I think it reminds me sort of a few other games that just do minor twists on existing formulas, but completely change the dynamic of the game. So it made me think of Snake Pass. Have you ever heard or played of that, Nate or Andy?
No.
played Snake Pass. No.
Yeah, it's a really bizarre little game that didn't get much acclaim. I mean, it was known, but it had a cult following, partially because it's extremely frustrating to play. But it's essentially a 3D. Imagine a Banjo Kazooie or Super Mario 64 style 3D platforming game, except you can't jump. It's a funny restriction, but you're a snake in this kind of colorful jungle world, and you slither across the ground. And the main way that you get across obstacles is by wrapping yourself around them and continually moving up higher by doing that kind of wrapping. It's very counterintuitive when you start using it, but just by kind of taking that very simple proposition of, okay, platforming game, but you can't jump, or in Hollow Knight's case, platforming game, but you don't necessarily have to die. It just opens up so many other things. So yeah, I've been enjoying that. I've also yeah, sorry.
The way you described it to me made it sound like it sort of has an interesting take on solving the like lock and key mechanisms that usually guide where your character can go within the world, with more of like a skill based and a difficulty ramp up than one that's actually mechanical, right? Yeah. So it sounded kind of like squishy and gray where the boundary was for play. Like that was, I don't know. Does that sound right?
Yeah, no, I think this comparison has been beaten to death and over again, but the Dark Souls comparison is apt, I think, because it's not in terms of punishing difficulty, but more in terms of the idea that Dark Souls helped propagate, not that it was the first to do it, but of these enemies that they get harder, sure, they might have more health, sure, but what actually changes and is difficult about them isn't just kind of like arbitrary stat bonuses, but it's that they have really unique movement sets, and you could be late in the game, have lots of powers and lots of health, and still find yourself getting clowned by these guys because you're not being careful, you're not thinking how you're moving or jumping around them, and that's the nice thing, is that in addition to the lore and all the really careful work that's really been done to create this setting,
that kind of thing.
I just keep finding myself surprised. I'll find an enemy and I'll think, oh well, I'm great now. I'll just do this little spin dash thing and knock it out and keep moving, and it will just I'll die. And it only has 3 health or 4 health or something like that. But it just has really especially with the bugs, so you have bugs that behave sort of in the ways that you would imagine different bugs to behave. So you have praying mantises that kind of have these wide slashing movements. You have bees that kind of annoyingly buzz around and move in ways that make it difficult for you to actually get a shot in. Even in this way, maybe I can round out my little section by saying it also reminded me of another one that I forgot to talk about last time that I recommended to Nate, Owlboy, which is another Metroidvania-ish 2D platforming game in which you can fly, which just it presumably would completely change the challenge of that kind of a game. Well, if you can fly, then there's no falling, you don't fall into chasms or pits or anything. But they do a lot of really creative stuff that maybe I don't want to spoil it, but that make it almost shmup-like as you're flying around, things tracing you and following you, and it gives it a sense of freedom. So I've just been enjoying all these little indie experiences that, as we said last time, that I'm catching up on since I don't have a PC that isn't a potato. So
PC potato.
Yeah.
Nice. That's turning into a baked potato as we speak.
Yeah, exactly. This thing is overheating. There's a few others that we could talk about at some point. I've been really jamming on Death Road to Canada with my friend. There's a few other. I got Mario Tennis Aces just to mess around, but maybe we could hear a bit about what have you been playing?
So all I've been playing with electronic media has been Octopath Traveler, which has been really addictive and a joy, honestly. It has a lot of traps and pitfalls in terms of a cliched story, but it varies enough, and I was afraid that I described it originally to Alex as feeling kind of symmetrical as you first start. So it's a game where you play as one of 8 different classes or characters, and they each have an individual storyline that they can follow, and they're arranged around a big lake in the center of the world, so they all can sort of branch off in their different paths. And for the first, I'd say 10 hours that I put into the game, because I've now put in like 35 to 40, it felt like each story was, basically some, inverted mirror image of a different character's story. And I was beginning to predict it and how it functioned, and it was starting to get incredibly boring, especially with the story itself being kind of cliched. But like many of the older RPGs that it is paying tribute to, it has a moment in it where where the worlds really just start to open and divulge greater possibilities and secrets to you. And I've just passed that moment, and it's just really, really lovely. And the mechanics are just spectacular. I haven't felt like this playing an RPG for a long time. So I like that a lot, and you should definitely try it out. It really is nothing dramatically innovative. It really does the homage thing that it's trying to do perfectly, I think. So, but aside from that, I have just recently gone through a bit of a marathon of tabletop games with my sort of tabletop community here in Louisville, and we got to the table for like the 10th time, I think, a game called Great Western Trail, which is what I'm interested in talking about today. I've mentioned it in the last podcast. So it's a game that simulates cattle ranching. It's designed by Alexander Pfister, and it's a large, relatively complex economic Euro game designed by a European designer about the American cattle industry in the 19th century. And in it, you play effectively as a large scale ranching operation. So you have, as you play the game, you're technically moving one worker down a path that's meant to represent the physical Great Western Trail, the trail that that cattle were taken on from Texas grazing grounds to market in Kansas City, and so you're like physically moving along that. But the way the game actually functions is, like I said, you're really sort of a titan of industry in this game, a titan rancher. So what you're trying to do is actually develop 3 different pathways of staff hiring. So you can hire cowboys to move your cattle for you, and they also give you discounts when you purchase better breeds of cattle. And then there are craftsmen, which help you like build the infrastructure along the trail. And as you do this, it's kind of like a company store mechanic. You build buildings along the trail that only your cowboys can use. So there's like a vertical monopoly thing happening. And then you also hire engineers to help you build a rail network that gets your cattle to market. And this is like, that's the part that actually is the most interesting thing about the game to me. And I'm about to go on a critical tirade about it in a moment, but I have to start by saying I actually do think the game is mechanically lovely, a really, really fun game to play. You really do get a sense as you're doing this that you are seeing time pass. You're watching, this motion of, this big journey of cattle every time you go through the trail. Functionally, it's a rondel game. So you're moving along this trail from point A to point B, Texas to Kansas City, and then starting over, basically like with a new season each round. It's a lovely game to play, but it has this problem, which I'm always thinking about when I'm playing Euro games, which is, it's talking about the development of an incredibly exploitative and colonial moment in the history of this country, and it's actually talking directly about industries that affected indigenous people in the West and the Southwest, and it includes indigenous people in the game in a way that is incredibly problematic. So there are representations of Indians, is what they call them, that you trade with, or that it says you trade with them, but there's one of two things you can do with them. They are represented by teepees that are in a little canyon in the map, and when you get to certain places along the board, you can quote unquote trade with them. Now that allows you to either take one of these things off and take one of the teepees off of the map, which gets you money, or it allows you to pay them to remove an obstacle for motion. And again, both of these things are acts of removal. You're actually removing teepees from the map, and you get one of two things: you get an easier pathway as you move along this board, or you get a bunch of money. So effectively, although the action is always called trading, effectively what you're doing is moving or stealing, both in one of two ways. Which is, and it doesn't. I mean, it really doesn't even bother to try and address this. So that's problematic in its own right. But the most, like, as I've played it a bunch of times thinking about this, and really like the deepest problem in this game, in terms of representation, is that it's sort of an implicit educational device, I think, in the choice to have one little area of the map be the only place where the indigenous people are represented at all.
Yeah.
And so the game is set in the 19th century. So this is active, allotment, reservation, infrastructure construction. This is the time of the Dawes Act, which broke up, communal tender of lands, communal ownership of lands, and forced tribes and individual members of tribes to start taking on private property, which was a devastating. It was the mechanism by which 90 million acres of land were stolen from Western and Southwestern tribes. So it's like that's happening in history, in the history this game is set in, but it isn't happening in the game at all. It's a de facto quality that the Native Americans, unnamed, no Comanche, no Apache, no Dakota. I mean, they're just Indians, just exist already in a little canyon that is their reservation.
Right.
It's it's not a process. So this is, and it's, I looked up interviews with the designer to think about this, and I actually found one that directly addressed the question of, how did you think about, or how did you research Native American culture or history as you were making this? And his response was basically, I read some Wikipedia articles and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, but this reminds me of the classic. We'll have to link it on the WordPress, but the Bruno Fedudi article about colonialism and representation in games and his own games, and how aggressively ignorant that piece was, because it's sort of that pseudo self-awareness. He's actually somebody who's clearly read around a bit. He's talking, I think he cites Orientalism or one of these famous texts or something like that. But essentially the conclusion he comes to is the kind of, South Park style thing of just like, well, what are you going to do? Like, this is, we just want to make games, so who cares? And, that's a fine justification for a vice, but like not for really anything else other than that. I just think about that idea of like these, you think about Five Tribes, all the controversies over the slave cards in Five Tribes and how they had to change those, and how a lot of the debate kind of, even by the supposedly, well-meaning liberal end of that debate, ends up reaffirming and almost confirming the ignorance of the other side by appearing to be fidgeting over window dressing. This idea of like, well, what are we supposed to do? You just want to change a card? You just want to change this thing? Like, it's not really, you're not going to change the game. It's still about this thing. But it does, what you're saying to me sounds like it goes to show the idea of the innate protagonist. Like, of course we would make this game, and there's not even, the inherent assumption is already that, your protagonists are going to be the cowboys, the white cowboys, not even to get into like the indigenous / Mexican / Latino cowboy culture, but that like you are this. So then, oh shit, how do we incorporate this other aspect? Right, okay, we'll put some teepees over here, mix a bunch of cultural signifiers, and then throw them in the game as just the standard. It's a slightly what's the word? Defanged other. So it's not so much the angry or savage Indian from like the classic cowboy movies and films, but it's still just like it's another version of the, the, what's the word, noble savage kind of in nature,
Right.
trading, just existing in their space, not really intruding on white civilization kind of thing.
Right. So one of the responses that Pfister gives is, when asked about representation, is that he intended to suggest that for a player for a settler, I suppose, to do well in this context, you have to trade with the Indians. You have to cooperate, right? Which is, it masks the history.
Yeah.
So I'm by no means an expert. I did do a tiny little bit of research, like for an hour, about ranching in this time period. And actually, if it would be really interesting if Pfister or I think it's Stronghold Games is the company he published with.
Yeah, it is.
In the making of this game, had considered including what I'm about to talk about in the actual thematic content of the game, which is, as allotment is going on, as land is being opened up for European descended settlers to start matching and building up the rail network. The part of the actual functioning of allotment, the intention of the allotment policy, was the paternalistic idea: we're going to assimilate, savage culture into the civilized property owning, way of our nation. And one of the ways they tried to do that was actually by training. They sent BLM agents out to train different tribal members in ranching, in cattle ranching. So there was actually a series of different attempts and projects to make this work. I think the Apache were pretty successful with it. And the thing is, from the little hour-long bit of research that I just did, it sounds like the struggle that they had was actually the allotment policy itself. It broke up their wealth into tiny allotments, into individual property and property and wealth, and very few tribes were able to effectively own cattle in trust, which is very often what corporate Europeans were doing. They had institutions to move massive amounts of wealth, to build rail networks, to buy the huge number of cattle it takes to make this a profitable industry. They could. What if they had decided to include this? I don't know what it would have looked like, but it's just lazy theming when you come to when you deal with this historical content, I think, and I don't think I don't think it needs to be acceptable anymore.
No, I don't think it is either. And it also goes to show what you're saying of what I think is when you have you're designing this game, you say you have these good intentions, and then there's kind of almost the elephant in the room of, I think there is a subconscious realization that if you take these concerns too seriously, you might end up with a different game. So they don't want to change their game, and so it's kind of like a foregone conclusion that not to get too frou-frou on you, but you remember the old Spivak thing about can the subaltern speak, of you're just kind of the whole situation is set up so that there is an existing subaltern position, and it's never going to go beyond that. And it would be interesting to think about what would it look like to be designing a game like that and to have a moment of revelation and have to redesign your game and come out with something else. Yeah, I wonder if games like Spirit Island or other games that are starting to address these themes might have come out of that question.
So it's funny that you mentioned, because I was going to transition to Spirit Island, and it's exactly what you're talking about. And looking at the interviews with Pfister, the way his design process worked is he started with a mechanic, and from the mechanic of applied the thematic content. He had some idea that it was going to be set in the United States and in the West, but the mechanic came first, right? So compare that to Spirit Island, which and I looked up an interview with Eric Royce, or Eric Roos, I think is actually how it's pronounced, who is the also European designer of Spirit Island. And obviously, if we look at other media, there's an inherent problem always with a European trying to represent a colonized people in their media, right? Yeah. That's just an issue, I think, with board games. There's a lot of European designers, right? But Eric Roos makes a much more earnest attempt at this. And part of how that functioned with Spirit Island, the interview that I listened to was an interview by the podcast The Thoughtful Gamer. I think it's episode 33 of The Thoughtful Gamer, if you want to check this out. It's a very long, detailed conversation with Eric Roos about the design process behind Spirit Island. And with Spirit Island, the theme came first. The idea of, and for listeners and for Andy, if you're not familiar with Spirit Island is a cooperative game in which you play as the spirits of an island, probably set somewhere in the.
Oh, I have heard of this. Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that sounded amazing.
It is pretty amazing. And you play as the fictional spirits of this fictional island. Some probably set in the Pacific, dealing with real European colonizers showing up at your shore and playing as the spirits in collaboration with the indigenous inhabitants of the island. They're named the Dahan. You fend off invasion. You try to essentially wipe out the colonizers or scare them away, or neutralize them in some respect. That's how you win. And so that concept is where the game was born, and around it, all of the mechanics were designed. So, and in listening to the story of this, there's this amazing thing that Roos describes of thinking about how to balance the Dahan. And I wouldn't have known this if I hadn't listened to the interview, but when you start out, there's actually a very small scattered number of Dahan on the island, and a very small number of Europeans who've already landed. And the actual concept for this was that the moment the game starts is the early contact moment after disease has already spread rampantly through the indigenous population. Diseases, brought by Europeans and their animals that the indigenous population has no built-up immunity to. And this is a common story, but he actually considered what his island would look like, his fictional island would look like, if 90% of the population had just been killed off by disease. And that was how he balanced his game.
That's incredible.
That's interesting. Although I do wonder, Nate, if it's sort of, we've had this discussion before of sort of like, what is the threshold to these kinds of things? Because we've played Spirit Island together, actually, and I really enjoyed it, and it really is refreshing to see these themes. But just to be a hard ass a little bit, I wonder if there's a way in which, as you're saying, that the sort of inherent challenge of designing games around these themes when you're representing these other communities and these other histories is to still reach for the magical. In the sense, I think about like Rising Sun, a lot of other games which, without getting into the history of like Japan has an imperial history and all that. I mean more the idea in the current like world racial order, the idea of the magicalness of the other, going back to like the magical Negro, like this kind of thing of. So Spirit Island is kind of a response to the inherent colonialism of so many board games, and part of the way it addresses that is through what seems like an inversion, but another attempt to kind of that narrative of like the indigenous people who are one with the earth, who have this inherently innocent kind of living that has been poisoned by the non-innocent form of the European living, which can kind of lead into that infantilizing thing. Obviously, I have a lot more time for Spirit Island than I do for other kinds of games, because you can see the effort being made there. But I just think about what is that threshold, and even when we played Freedom, Freedom is another board game which I don't know, Andy, that would actually be a great one to use in your classroom if you haven't heard of it.
What's it about?
It's about the history of slavery in the United States and of the Underground Railroad. And it's an amazing, really, it's an amazing effort, and it's a very educational game. I mean, no matter how many flaws it might have, I mean, I work with young people, any room with young people discussing that game is going to be an interesting room. But, and again, maybe Nate can reflect back to me a little bit because I think you might have played more than I have. But my experience playing the game was it was really fascinating and it was addressing lots of concepts that most games don't. And just to give you a picture, you kind of have a map of the United States. You have these plantation boxes, tiles in different parts of the southern United States. And they're kind of slowly filled with little brown cubes. These are representing slaves. And
they're actually weirdly white cubes.
Oh, are they? I could have sworn they were brown. Well, anyway, they're cubes,
or at least very beigeish.
Yeah, sure, beige cubes, yeah. And the idea is you're trying to funnel them north to Canada or to other routes around the Underground Railroad, and there's slave catchers and people on the way trying to get you. And on the left side of the board, there's this whole really interesting tableau system where there's different eras that are going through, like the different eras of slavery, and different figures are popping up. You turn a card over and it has like a famous abolitionist and little quotes and stuff, and you could use these cards for different effects. It's all really well done. One idea I had, the reason I'm bringing it up is because my reaction to the game was sort of like, this is an interesting in that it although there is a heavy, there's voices of like Frederick Douglass and other, slave revolts and things like this. It very much has what to me is a very kind of standard U.S. narrative about slavery and civil rights of like, oh, well, there was slavery and then the abolitionists came around and then there wasn't slavery anymore. So there is kind of emphasis on that, on the, the outer sort of bourgeois white face of the anti-slavery movement. Mm-hmm. And then it's just even to the mechanical level of like, you're kind of trundling around these beige cubes. It's just interesting to think about what would a game that actually kind of rooted itself in the wide proliferation of slave resistance, slave revolts, maroon communities, these kinds of things. How would that look different? And it's another case where it's an obvious point, but the designer himself is a white guy who's clearly has good intentions, but it's just that I think about that. How would if you have the ideas for these games? I mean, even we've talked about this in the last one of designing a game and it being part of a larger community process. I mean, is it a question of if you want to take on themes that are this heavy and this weighty, then you kind of need to do a bit of homework and maybe be reaching out to people and figuring out who else can be part of making that game. Maybe it's less of your baby than it would be otherwise. I'm thinking about what would it look like to forfeit some ownership over the creative content of the game if you're recognizing that this theme ain't big enough for just one of us. Like, that I'm taking on these intense themes, so maybe I need to do a bit of soul searching in order to take. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So no, it does. Yeah.
Go for it, Andy.
I was going to say, this reminds me of an experience I had last year. I went to a local board game shop, was doing almost like a demoing session. So all these game designers came in with like basically alpha builds of various board games. And this one guy had a game that was set in, like around like Rwanda. And it was like almost like a mystical kind of thing, but it was like shepherding animals and all this stuff, and it was fun. The designer was white, and again, good intention. And we're talking to him about his game. And he goes, "Yeah, this began life as a game about the Rwandan genocide." And my friends and I were kind of like, "What? Like, whoa!" Like he goes, "Yeah, I started to like map out the mechanics, and I was talking with like my friends and my coworkers, and they were just like, yeah, like." You can't, like, his heart was like in the right place, but it was basically like dude, like you just shouldn't, and then he had to change it, and I was like, oh, because it was good and it was fine, it was actually kind of respectful to the culture and everything around it, but it was just awkward, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, I think it also asks just that question of, is the fact that a story can be told, does that mean it should be told? And that might sound a bit of a far-reaching or abstract question, but that's what I'm always thinking about in representation. And I think I brought it up last time when we were talking about like the way that film or visual art can become borderline snuff sometimes, with the idea of like, oh well, we can portray this, so we should. And I'm all about pushing boundaries and even having like Eisenstein style shock experiences that fireworks under your chair, shock you out of your seat in the movie theater. But just the idea of like, yeah, maybe the responsibility of the game designer, because it's not really something that, and maybe we'll be transitioning into this shortly, talking about the Scratchware Manifesto, but this idea of like the game designer as this kind of floating monad in the universe, just ideas occurring to them and just putting them out there is just obviously dumb. It's obviously a lie. And I think there's something to be said for that thing of like, okay, so, well, even a recent game that's gotten a lot of press, if you take it down a notch from these like more serious political themes, Fog of Love, which is one that's gotten quite a bit of discussion because of how unique it is. And I'll just frame it that Fog of Love is a game designed by, I can't remember, a Scandinavian designer, I can't remember which country, but who had a big board game collection. His wife didn't like any of the board games, and so he was trying to design a board game that he could play with her. And he ended up designing this kind of bizarre game/simulation experience called Fog of Love, in which two players sit down over this really beautifully designed board and pick two characters with randomized traits, and then you play through the phases of your relationship. And it's hard to describe it. It kind of, you can either be really open and a very trusting partner, or you can be somebody who's very conniving. You have secret goals, and that secret goal could simply be, I want to make my partner happy. But the other sometimes the secret goal could be, I want this relationship to fail. And kind of the main mechanic of the game is every round there's a series of cards that you draw that present scenarios, and then there's various options for the scenarios. Like, okay, your partner's ex is in town. What do you think their reaction is going to be to their ex being around? And then you both have this poker chip that has had letters on it, and you guess you each guess what you think the other person's answer is going to be. So it might be like, oh, I think they're going to be totally cool with it, and they're not going to say anything to them because they respect me, or I think that they might go talk to them behind my back. You flip over the choice, and then based on the revelation, you different points are distributed. And on the side, there's this whole track of like emotional states of like more controlling or less controlling, more emotional or more rational, these kinds of things. It's a very hard game to play with your partner. It's a really fun game to play with a friend, and especially with a witness to the two people watching it, because you create this very borderline role play / actual game experience. But the reason I'm bringing this up is on a smaller scale. What's very clear when playing the game is how much thought and care was put into the depiction of something that could be potentially really painful and traumatic, which is love and sex and relationships. And that kind of theme, you could just, there's been many games that just are basically just endless versions of Cards Against Humanity with similar themes, like, oh, then we had sex and we killed each other. Oh, I stole all your money and now we're divorced. Like these kinds of very swingy, wild consequences. Mm-hmm. And depending on what floats your boat, borderline kind of triggering or offensive kind of things. And this game, I mean, it has its sort of questionable moments, but there's so much thought put into the idea of what it means to build a relationship that I actually played it with my wife and she didn't like it, but I just appreciated the experience. I wasn't in it to win it necessarily, or I actually failed pretty hard in the relationship. I was a bad partner, but yeah, I don't know. I guess that's an open-ended question again about thinking about what does it look like to depict something that might be beyond your ken, and do you need some help with that, or do you need to just take your time?
So before we transition, because we're getting to around the time where we should transition to the Scratchware Manifesto.
Yeah,
I have an answer for you.
Okay, yeah, tell me.
Well, and I don't have the answer. I've just encountered it recently and been reading about it. I'm going to talk about this game, which looks really great, and I think I'm going to go ahead and challenge us as well to maybe get our hands on a copy of it and test it out at some point.
Yeah.
But it's a game called Loi Loi, the savings game, and I was introduced to this by a site and a project that I really want to rep for a second, called Analog Game Studies. They have a site, analoggamestudies.org, and they publish really, really in-depth pieces, essays, critiques, mostly focused on a colonial or anti-capitalist critique of gaming, both video games and analog games, mostly analog games though. And so I found Loy Loy this game through them, but so Loy Loy the Savings Game is a game developed by UC Irvine's Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. And I can't talk about them, I don't know them. But they developed it in Cambodia with interview and with in conversation with the female Cambodian garment workers that the game is about. And so in this game, you play as a Cambodian garment worker trying to save up with all the other players at the table to purchase your own garment factory to own cooperatively. And so like already this is like pretty exciting, right? But to me, it's especially exciting because but because it does a thing that I think is the answer to. I talked about this in the last podcast. The answer to how you represent cooperative play without and cooperative labor in a game. And that answer is you have to simultaneously work for the collective and consider how much to save collectively at the same time as looking out for your own self-interest and dealing. It's a role-playing game. When you start this game, you're actually given a role and a sister, and you have to decide at the beginning whether or not you have living parents, whether or not you have a good relationship, and you have real life issues that you have to pay for with your wages, which are never enough to cover what you need to pay for as you play it. So you have to also consider how much you're going to contribute to a collective. What it's actually about is a thing called a ROSCA. Again, don't know much about it, but it's ROSCA. And let me see if I can break that acronym down. It is, sorry, I have the thing up here, but it's a rotating savings and credit association. Okay. And so what it is it's a type of collective risk management by pooling. So it's a way that low-income communities the world over have pooled money to save and deal with issues that require larger amounts of capital than an individual can deal with, an individual living in poverty. So as you play, you're constantly deciding: am I going to use my wages to like to put food on the table, to like help my sister who might be asking me for a loan, or am I going to save some of this money to put into, or how much money am I going to save to put into the ROSCA? And I love the concept, and it doesn't surprise me that it's the result of an in-depth project that involved people who are directly affected by the game is talking about. It just looks super cool. So I definitely recommend checking it, both of you. And I think we should play it at some point so that we can talk about it in a little more depth.
So I think maybe it would be good for us to start talking about sort of what part of the inspiration was for this podcast in the first place. We've been dealing a lot with these themes of how games are made, why they're made, with what intention, and I sort of pushed this myself as one of the main creators or people pushing to this podcast in the first place. But I really positioned ourselves, and you could go back to the first one and listen if you'd like. I positioned ourselves in the legacy of Greg Costigian and his website Play This Thing, and specifically the Scratchware Manifesto, which was a document that came out in the year 2000, right at the beginning of the apocalypse. And it was a really bizarre, rambling, sometimes lucid and prescient, sometimes really misguided text that it had an effect, but it didn't have as much influence as you might think for such a rousing document. But it is kind of like a carbon dating of the time and of what was happening at the time. And there's a lot of sentiments in there that I think are rich themes for us to explore. So I've mercilessly bothered these two folks here to have a read through, for all of us to have read it, and just to sort of start picking out some themes from things that we found in there that were interesting. I thought maybe I could ask Andy, since Nate and I have been kind of dominating the discussion. Is there anything in particular that struck you about reading the Scratchware Manifesto?
The thing that struck me the most about reading the Scratchware Manifesto is how relevant it felt to 2018. It's almost 20 years old, and yet, yeah, I've been seeing a lot of articles the last 6 months or so about crunch time, about development cycles, about budgets in games, and why we have endless sequels. And I feel like things have gotten a lot, in terms of the major companies, things have gotten worse in that regard.
Yeah.
EA buying developers, shutting them down, projects becoming really untenable, and really dependent upon, you know, basically breaking people's backs in terms of their labor to get things done on a release schedule. So that was just kind of what surprised me the most. I kept looking at the date it was or the date it was written to make sure I had it like correct, which is kind of insane.
Yeah. I thought the section, there was a section where one of the anonymous designers does an analysis of an article about Daikatana and about the hype around Daikatana, which I remember. And I remember being kind of uninterested and glad that it turned out not to be something I needed to waste my time with in the end. But you see in the interviews that they're really glorifying that idea of like like you're saying, backbreaking labor, 18-hour shifts, no breaks. And the whoever that designer is, because the only one I remember is Greg Kostikian being designer X. That particular designer is sort of mocking this idea of what he calls like vampire capitalism. Like, oh, thank you, vampire overlords, for giving me the chance to work on this game and ruin my health and things like that. I was struck by like you said, some of the things it says, like, why are games still released in such buggy states and they expect us to buy them? Why do they? Where's the profit margins for creators versus developers? There's the whole thing of like the Switch tax that people talk about with like how expensive Switch games are. And it's funny because I've listened to some game news and game podcasts where the mantra is kind of like, well, it sucks, but I mean, it's a good business decision. Obviously, they want to make money. And I thought to myself, like, you could kind of say this about anything, right? You could say this about the mob. You could say this about the mob. Like, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, he obviously they need to extort people. I mean, it's a great way of making money, And I think they do bring up a little bit in the manifesto about the disparities between publishers and the heads of the corporations and how much money they're making, and then the claims. There's a great quote in there that says, "Why are we buying $50 boxes of air?" Which feels especially prescient in the time when some Switch games are coming out, and you open the box and it says, this is a eShop download.
Yeah, exactly. It's like just a little card. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
that's funny. That's not. I think that's not what it was. I think it was to specifically just platforms. The consoles. With $50 boxes of air, but it is actually literally what you get sometimes when you order a game now.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so I think there is a lot there that does feel like it's using a lot of the cyberpunk manifesto type language. It even cites that at one point. It says, I'm just looking at some quotes I pulled out here. We're working in the most innovative and exciting artistic field on the planet. They evoke almost this Zapatista language at one point, and the kind of classic Mexican leftist cry of "Ya basta!" They're like, "Basta! We need to change the game industry. Death to software, death to EA." They say, "Death to Vivendi, Sony, Sega, Nintendo." All things that honestly I don't have a problem with. But I thought, I don't know if Nate or any of you also noticed that there was a little bit of the naivete as well with some of the claims, or some of the way it's very focused on creators and saying, there's an injustice being done to creators. But this question of the labor of games kind of stops there. It even addresses itself. I think Kostikian himself addresses himself to Redwood City, which is in California. And and it does, it doesn't really go beyond that. And I couldn't help but thinking, okay, yes, more distribution amongst creators and people in the industry, but also, where do our games come from? Where is the mention of the factories and of the places that these games are made? I know we talked a little bit about this last time, but I was wondering if either of you had that thought when you were reading.
I did. I mean, it was funny. It did feel a little naive, but it does actually. I don't know which of the anonymous writers was making this point, but it does at certain times talk a bit about the actual physical industry of game manufacturing, and it's got a sort of a techno-salvationist point. This is the naive part, I think. But I think the utopia they imagine is a totally online distribution network that involves minimal actual physical physical manufacturing. And it does sort of point to the massive amount of waste and call it waste. But I think that's as far as it goes in addressing the the physical industry. But
this is sort of a question. For me, sorry, continue.
That's all right. If I start, I'm gonna just wax away, and I'll save it.
So I mean, I was gonna say that. It's a good point, and in some ways, some of the ways that it was prescient is that it's talking about online distribution models, and it's saying, you go into a game store, there's only 20 games on the shelf, and you can't find any other kinds of games. And we're lucky enough to be living in a time where there are these distribution models. There's Steam, and there's GOG, and there's people releasing independent games all the time. One contradiction that I thought was interesting, and I'll link this article in the WordPress, is there's a quote where it says, "What do you need to fund a game? Food stamps and enough scratch to pay the electricity bill," which I thought was
I highlighted that also,
which was an interesting kind of even though they're critiquing that raw work to death culture, is a weird romanticization of that, because there's a piece that I read, I think, called "Towards an Art History of Video Games" or something like that. And it made a really interesting point that even the idea of the indies of the industry, they didn't come about from these rags to riches stories. They're sort of, you had a lot of the people who made some of the, Braid was a big one. What was some of the other big ones? I'm thinking of Fez and a few of the other really big indie games that helped push the limits and make people think that this was possible. There were people who previously had experience working in big studios. Some people who had to invest years of their own money. I think the quote for Braid or one of these was over 200,000 of the designer's own personal investment before they even got to the point of releasing the game. So there's kind of this interesting lack of talking. They're criticizing the labor of the video games industry, but also invisibilizing the kinds of labor and the kinds of wealth that are needed to even, be a game designer in the first place, or to be able to be in this world. And I couldn't help but think of, this is something I actually ended up writing a short story about that ended up having nothing to do at all with games, at least on the surface. But the question just over and over again that I come back to, and I said this to Nate last week when we spoke about this, is sort of the question of, is our hobby a limited hobby? I mean, is it a chronologically limited phenomenon? And I mean in the sense of, I'm specifically talking about resource shortages and things like that, there's this way of talking about games in this mystified, ethereal world above planet Earth. And, I was just thinking about nickel, cobalt mines, iron, copper, the things that are required to make these things. And whatever, from pessimistic to optimistic outlooks on our generation and the following generations, there's a part of me that thinks are we kind of on a sinking ship? And if we are, what does that mean about how we enjoy the games that we play? What does it mean about, what we've said last time? Is there ethical consumption? Does that even mean anything? I could keep going with this, but does that evoke anything for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, that gets at the basic tension of that manifesto, I think, it's in that quote that you pulled out, which is, what is it? Scratchware is, I don't know, I can't remember
food
exactly the word.
Food
It's
stamps and scratch.
Yeah, it's all you need to make. Yeah, food stamps and a force of will. That's what you need to make a game.
Yeah.
They talk about that, and then they talk about the massive exploitation involved, specifically just for software developers. in a big AAA game industry. And I think what I don't really stated, and it's kind of fine because it's a manifesto. It's like they're hurling this like baby of an idea out into the world by writing this, right? But I think that kind of I don't know, maybe the thesis that's in between the lines is that the only way to save games from becoming just another, from the gaming industry from becoming just another, exploitative, fucked up. Sorry, we can bleep that if we're child friendly capitalist industry. Is to have it be a labor of love.
Right.
It feels kind of like that's what they're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that kind of bothered me, and I think this is very of when it was written, thing that's changed a lot, is they sort of talk about labor and organization, but then they talk about unions and kind of this like, that's like the past, man. Like we're going to be these like small teams that get stuff done and we're going to change the world. And, like organizing like unions is like, that's some like 1930s stuff, and it's kind of funny because,
To be fair, I think that's a little, that voice at that point is supposed to be a little sardonic.
Sarcastic, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
like we all know that this conversation is fruitless because the culture in this industry is already so anti-union anyways. I feel like that's kind of the idea.
But I do think what Andy's saying is fair in the sense that even beyond that, it doesn't really present any kind of coherent political vision, which, as you say, it's fine. It's a manifesto, but I think it is a fair critique to say, they're really passionate, labors of love, all that, but then, okay, so what are you saying? So kind of, okay, we'll make small teams, and then the games industry and the world will be better. It doesn't kind of go much more beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
And
sorry,
did you want to keep?
I feel like I cut you off, Andy.
No, not really. I was just going to comment because I feel like it's a very like kind of Gen X-y document in that way.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, I mean, I'm a millennial. I've seen an uptick in interest in unions. I feel like among people my age, I'm
Right.
29. And I just saw Sorry to Bother You a couple weeks ago in the movie theater, which is like this incredible sort of black comedy / slight science fiction film about a call center that tries to organize, and just a character who gets completely caught. It's so fascinating. It's so good.
What was that again?
It's called Sorry to Bother You.
Nice.
It's really good. Yeah, it's by this guy named Boots Riley. He's a musician.
Boots Riley.
And it's his first film. Yeah. The Coup guy.
I'm in.
Yeah, it's so good, dude. Yeah, just a quick side note. Sorry, Alex.
No. There's no. What do you mean? It's all connected in the vast tapestry of this cosmos. Well, I was going to say, I think that question of organizing, of unionization, actually specifically led me down a path of thinking about, and I brought this up last time, is, okay, so there's the idea of what is the content of games, how could they be kind of more relating to the world and struggles in their actual content. Then there's the idea of, okay, in the way they're made, like the people making them, how could that be part of a community process? And the actual physically, the people making them, how could that be more inclusive? And then what I think the next step for me is sort of putting it in the global world system perspective of infrastructure and resources and how these things are actually made. My thought was just, how could there, what kind of creative and interesting organizing / artistic intervention / game projects could there be that linked up with the places that actually produce these things on the ground? And for that, I actually was thinking about how there's kind of a traditional model of a bit of the the victimization, where people talk about, for example, there's the Gap, and Gap people who make clothing for the Gap, and it's this like, there's the Gap, it's this big corporation, and then the workers over there who need our help. And it made me think about our narratives about one of the biggest places where the creation of both board and video games is outsourced to, which is China, and our narratives about like this totalitarian authoritarian state where people are Foxconn factories, they had to install suicide nets to stop people from killing themselves. And I thought to myself, okay, what kinds of stuff is out there in the first place? And I actually came across a really interesting text called China on Strike, it's published by Haymarket Books, which is one of these kind of socialist rags, but they got some good stuff. And I just wanted to read just this little paragraph from the preface of the book as I started reading it. They're kind of explaining their procedure and how they made this book, and a lot of it had to do with just Chinese students and sociologists and people who slowly built connections and networks of trust to do these interviews. And there's a paragraph here that I thought was really relevant where they said, this book begins by correcting a misperception about labor politics in China. Chinese workers are frequently depicted in the media and even in academic studies as complete victims, unable to conjure any resistance to the overbearing power of transnational capital and a deeply authoritarian communist party. In the West, we are told that it is our responsibility to act beneficently towards these pitiable souls by consuming ethically. Collective action and labor movements are simply not possible in a globalized world, so we should settle for individualized and marketized forms of sympathy. Without diminishing the scale of labor rights violations in China or elsewhere in the global South, the stories in this volume suggest a few things, and it kind of goes on to talk about some more specifics. But there's this sentence here where they say, "Try as it might, capital cannot expand without constantly reproducing its historical antagonist, the working class." And there's a lot more there. Obviously, this is a very particular kind of Marxist, account and interpretation of these things, but I thought that was a really grounding quote. And as I was starting to read through the collection, thinking about the idea of projects that blur the boundaries and that make these connections, it almost forces you to think beyond the confines of just a game and more of something like we mentioned last time, our friend Brian's project, the Toolbox for Education and Social Action, of what would it look like to create interventions that helped sort of highlight these voices and link up with organizing that's happening there, and in addition to reflecting that in the contents of the games themselves. That's obvious, that's a tall ask, but I don't know what you guys think, but that was kind of what started running through my mind. I've silenced the crowd.
It's a tall ask indeed.
Or maybe it's just a question of, it's not something that, I don't think we can found this project today. I guess I'm just thinking, as we slip down the slippery slope, what are some of the branches that we can hold on to as we're falling? That's my pessimistic view.
So the thing I've mentioned earlier, the Loy Loy project, because it has, I actually don't know about how it's produced. That would be interesting to research. But there's definitely I just don't feel like I know enough right now.
Right.
Because things like Loy Loy exist, which is which is at least developed in a community engaged way, and I know because things like the Tessa Institute, Tessa exist, where where they focus really carefully on fair production and fair manufacturing. I know that people are doing it, and I don't know enough of them. Maybe it's a research project, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Andy mentioned last time La Mala Industria, which kind of they focus a lot of their games on drawing out these themes. But I wonder if we're still, just because of the indirect nature of playing a game in your room on a monitor, makes it very difficult to confront these themes in a deeper way. It actually made me think of, if you let me just ramble for one more second, it made me think of an essay that had a really deep effect on me in university. I took a class on like labor and factories in China and workplace politics, and there's an amazing piece by this anthropologist Pun Nai called "Opening a Minor Genre of Resistance in Reform China: Scream, Dream, and Transgression in a Workplace." And I won't get into it too deeply, but there's this article is essentially about this anthropologist going to somehow managing to get her way into one of these factories that has boarding. So there's like beds and there's like dormitories essentially for the workers. And while she's there doing her studies and her interviews, there's one worker who keeps waking up in the middle of the night and just screaming at the top of her lungs and has these kind of really visceral, intense night terrors. And it's one of these navel gazy, but interesting academic essays that goes into, the author's questioning herself and saying, well, what does it mean to be writing about these things and these labor questions if I can't account for this scream? And she keeps positioning the scream throughout the essay and saying, like, that scream, this visceral experience of pain, like, where is it? Where is it in my writing? Am I accounting for it? Am I doing justice to that reality? And yeah, I guess that's the kind of question I'm thinking of, is like that discomfort with our hobby. Where is that? There's a sense of entitlement that we've talked about with the way a lot of fans interact with games, but where is that scream? That the pain and the exploitation at the base of what creates this industry. It's there. It's not there. It's
No, it's not. Yeah. I mean, I didn't really know any of these experiments or, small organizations until you guys mentioned them to me a couple weeks ago, in terms of people trying to ethically create games, from start to finish and what that looks like. And so it's such a tall order because the industry is so, it just doesn't want to grapple with any of it.
right. Well, maybe some of it,
Well,
and this is my bias, means the shift from thinking about it in terms of ethical consumption to like organizing. So the difference between
Mhm.
being like, well, I'll pick certain products and then that'll make me a better person, to being like, what is my place within this process allow me to do to change the actual nature of it? And the first thing I can think
Yes.
of is a board game manufacturer here in London that they do some really interesting games. They have some actual quite socially conscious messaging. I wonder if I should name them or not. Well, I won't for now. And I've talked to them a little bit, not a lot, but I used to go to their studios to chat because they had a game night. And there was a day when they mentioned this question. They were talking about ethical production and stuff. And the guy turned to me and said, like, "Oh, I'm actually going to go to China because I want to do a tour of the factories and make sure that it's good conditions." And then he mentioned to me, and he's like, "And but the thing is, they told me that this is actually a factory where they actually have dormitories, so it's kind of like great because it's like instead of just forcing the workers to travel home, it's like they have everything they need right there." And I thought to myself, that right there is kind of like the first step right there. I mean, we've been talking about it this whole podcast, is like just the very base idea of responsibility, of being like, maybe you should do your research a little bit, like it's not a very fun experience to be a rural migrant worker who cannot basically leave the compound of the place that you work and live at. And the idea that they were doing something benevolent by helping promote those kinds of labor practices. Maybe that's what I'm thinking about. But where can you start with that kind of awareness? Or is what we're doing, we didn't really ever define what we're doing. Do we see ourselves as trying to do a little bit of that, of creating some of that awareness?
I mean, I'm taking a step back because I'm in, like I just said, in territory that I really am not qualified to speak on. If I try and think about that manufacturer that I don't even know the name of.
That's all right.
But to take a step back with games, with this hobby of ours, I mean, it ultimately it's a leisure activity, right? It's or it is something that people do to relax, or it is something that people it occupies a specific place that is not necessarily inherently going to be perfect for critical engagement. Kind of honestly, I was just thinking kind of in a similar way to comedy. Comedy is much better and much older, right? But comedy has to exist, right? You have to be able to laugh at suffering. And because I think maybe it's fundamental to comedy, there's a massive amount of critical thought put into the work of comics these days. I think that's the thing that's just missing a little bit from this hobby. It's just there's that level of of thinking critically about it as happening. I don't know thinking about why we game. And it's not it feels like a solipsistic hobby, honestly. This is me, the cynic. I love it. I do it. It's rejuvenating for me. I don't know, in lots of ways. But ultimately games still feel solipsistic. They feel isolating. They isolate from trouble rather than allowing you to think about it.
Well, I was going to say I don't know if I completely agree with the idea that they're inherently leisure in the same sense that our films inherently leisure, our books. I mean, when novels first started coming around in history, they were often viewed as as waste of time and as just fantasies and pointless exercises that just were the same kind of line of argument. And film certainly, but from being like Nickelodeons and just kind of cheap tricks to being things that I think today we would understand as having power and messaging to them. Games kind of have a bit more of you're saying, a primordial aspect of like satisfaction that feels like it has to be part of it because it's like this kind of immediate response to whatever you're doing. But
that's a better way to say it.
But I do wonder, I mean, in the article I was saying about the history of video games, they drew some connections that I never actually really made before. They were going back to surrealists and to the Fluxus movements and to different art movements that almost, they were kind of arguing like you could see sort of precedents to games in what they were trying to do in the whole idea of participatory art culture and breaking down the barriers of of passive art and so-called dead art and creating structures and objects and things that you could interact with, that this is almost like presaging the whole idea of games. And I just wonder if that's being done. And also what an interesting point that they made there was that actually we kind of harp on this idea of why aren't games doing this, or they're just starting to do this. And the argument that this piece was making was that actually games have always been doing this. And it's kind of that you're talking about cycles of eras, because some of the earliest games were incredibly avant-garde and had these kind of concerns at the heart of them. And it was only after a certain kind of steam built, from the industry, when it started becoming profitable, that we lapsed into a kind of purely leisure form of game. But the newest phase of narrative gaming isn't necessarily completely new, but almost like a revival, a rediscovery of what early gaming kind of was about. I do hope that we can kind of keep these themes in mind as we continue to talk about games, and to treat our own project as kind of that investigative thing of trying to look for where there might be examples, where there might be models of how to do games differently, or what games could be before the sun burns out. Like see what we can do before we're all under the sea. That's kind of my interest.
Damn. Yeah, we've been like trending towards pessimism the longer we speak.
I know.
You're gonna end the podcast with the apocalypse?
Maybe we can edit this out. Maybe we can make it sound like we end on a revolutionary note. And that is it for our podcast today, everyone. Thank you for listening. I think we tried to take on quite a bit this time, but I think that's kind of the theme of what we're going to be trying to do is eyes bigger than our stomach. We want to take on as much as we can and see where we can go with it. And I hope you guys, I don't know if you think the same, but I'm hoping that we can kind of look at this as sort of as an investigative thing, or as an open-ended thing where we can try and see where it goes and see if we can help sort of contribute to answering some of these questions as we're making them.
Yeah, I mean, this is as much a project for me of self-education as it is, hopefully a useful journey for anyone listening. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I've learned so much from both of you. Just even talking to you the last couple of months on and off, let alone doing this podcast. It's fantastic.
And vice versa.
Aww.
All right, folks. Well, we'll hopefully be doing another one soon. I think I'm going to be out for a bit on some travels, but we'll see if we can't get something maybe for the end of August. And yeah, we'll see you all next time. Under the sea.
Under the sea.
Under the sea.
Are we really going to go to...
I don't know.
I think every time